So, welcome everybody from just about all around the world. And for some, it's very early, and for some, it's already quite late. And so, we are diving into the intricacies of the stacked running stitch. And I'll switch to my other camera. And here you see a sample cloth that I made several years ago. And I started out with doing this circle. I had already made circles with the running stitch before. And when you do that, and you start out with a series of columns, so to speak, these rays that are going outward, then you'll find that the circumference of this, well, actually spiral that you're making with a running stitch grows quite quickly, and that leads inevitably to your columns getting wider, and then at a certain point you will want they're getting too wide, and you will want to divide them in two, and then perhaps later again as the circumference grows. So that is a pattern that kind of happens naturally. And I don't know if you have seen the Zoom class on the stacked running stitch on the felt ball, but that's kind of the same thing. Going outward, you kind of automatically run into the fact that you want to divide the columns. But when you do it on a flat fabric like this, it's quite different. And not in a circle, you get quite of a different pattern. And we'll start with this one. And you can imagine that if I do a series of running stitches and then back and forth in columns, and I don't do anything, that you would just get straight columns. And yeah, that would be a little bit dull. So how can you make the columns move and create different patterns? This is the pattern that we start with, quite simple, but you have also more complicated patterns. And what do you need to do to get that type of pattern? So that's what this class is about. And I'll take my hoop. I've chosen this neutral colored. It's a hemp fabric, very similar to linen, and I hope that with dark threads that will give you enough contrast to see it. But you can do this on any color fabric and with any kind of color thread, of course. And I like to make the patterns with colors that are more or less from within the same color family. So you get a bit of that ombre effect that you see here, for instance, with the blue, and here with pink. You can also do it in one color. And I did that on this object, this kind of fake-like object, where I used just purple. And you can also use variegated thread, but it depends a bit on the type of variegated thread, how that will end up looking. If in your variegated thread the colors switch quite quickly, then you will get more of a mottled effect. When you have longer stretches of one and the same color, that will probably look better. But I'll show you what I do with these graded colors and how you can get a very subtle transition from one color to the other. So I'll take my first thread, scissors, yeah. And since the first sample that we're making is not too wide, and I'm not making my thread too long, because then I will be able to switch colors within a reasonable time. You can imagine if you have only a short bit to go with your thread and you have a very long thread, then it will take a very long time before you can switch colors. So I'm taking out 2 strands of stranded cotton. And I advise to take them always to take them out one by one. As you see, when you pull on one, the rest kind of curls behind your fingers. And when you've pulled it out, it loosens automatically. And I used to try to pull two threads out together, and then they sometimes got horribly entangled, and I was wasting time on untangling them instead of. So it is actually much quicker to take them out one by one. A needle. Yeah, I'll take this one. Thread my needle. And I'll tie a knot.
Excuse me, Miriam.
Yeah.
Do you have a long needle or just a normal?
Just a normal embroidery needle. Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't matter all that much. Just if you feel this it's comfortable to work with your fabric, it's okay. And that's the nice thing about this stitch. It's the running stitch. Well, then we're going to stack the row, so it's the stacked running stitch. But luckily, the running stitch is an incredibly easy stitch. So what I'm going to do is make, let's say, 5 running stitches, and this time I'm going with the grain of the fabric. That's not exactly necessary. You can do this stitch in any direction, and you could see that from the circle. That was, of course, in all directions. But to start out, it is easy to just follow the grain of the fabric. And just 5 running stitches of more or less equal length. So that's the first row. And now what I'll do is I'm turning my hoop, turning the fabric, and I'm going to do the second row from right to left again. And I come up just below the first row. And just maybe 1 thread of the fabric between the 2 rows. But don't worry, it does not have to be all that precise if it's 2 threads or you happen to do a stitch that's on top of the other stitch. That's not all that bad. You don't have to count threads for this technique. There is some tolerance for making little mistakes. So going back for the second row, and meanwhile Jenny has also entered. Welcome. And we've started by making a short row of 5 running stitches, and now I'm going to do the second row, and I'm going to do just about the same thing that I did in the first row. Doesn't have to be all that precise. Like I said, no, you don't have to count the threads, but doing more or less the same thing. Now for the third row, and again, I'm coming up just above the previous row. And I can now also already start to think of letting my columns lean to one side. So let's say I'm going to lean them to the right. That means in this case, I'm going down a little bit early, a little bit to the right, maybe just one thread, and also coming up a little bit to the right from the stitch in the previous row. So I'm doing the same thing, but everything shifts a tiny bit to the right. And maybe it helps if I make a drawing. So if you would have a series of stitches, and then in the second row we did more or less the same thing. Now, if I would continue like that, like I said, you would get just straight columns, and that would look a bit dull. So now I'm deciding that I want to let them lean to the right, start zigzagging. So I come up, I make the stitch a little bit to the right. And now I'm going to turn my hoop and go the other way. And then, of course, looking from this perspective, they are leaning a little bit to the left. So I'm going to make my stitches a tiny bit more to the left. So, and that way I'm going to let the columns move. And it can be a tiny bit to the left, can be one thread of the fabric, two threads of the fabric. As I said, it doesn't have to be all that precise. But especially in the beginning, it might help to take a close look. And then once you get going, it will be easier to feel the direction of the stitches and to move with that. So I'm going to do now the 5th row, and again shifting a little bit so that the columns start to lean to the right. And you will probably find that as you go along, the direction will be more visible, the pattern is appearing, and it will be a little bit easier to aim your needle and follow that pattern. So I think my thread is coming to an end. No, I might, no, I think I will end it. I might just not have enough to go to the other side. So I'll end my thread here. And what I'm now going to do is, this was a dark purple. And I'm going to take, one thread of that. And one thread of the medium purple. And preferably or more or less the same size. length, the thread. And by mixing a slightly darker and a slightly lighter thread, I get a color in between, and that will make the transition from one color to the other very inconspicuous. And very smooth. Hello, Beate. Glad to see you back. I hope you will be able to hear me now. So, a knot in my new thread. And I'm coming up at this side. And now they have been leaning to the right, but I want them to zigzag. And I could go on for a bit and let them lean more to the right. But now I'll try and nudge them in the other direction. So now I want to move them, let them lean to the left. So I'm coming up a little bit more to the left. And going down a little bit more to the left. So in this pattern where I've decided I want zigzags and I don't want the columns to bump into each other or get too wide or anything. That means that I need to have some kind of control over the stitches. This is not totally random. You have to, these type of patterns are, they ask for some awareness and for you to steer the process. So I'm now trying to steer the columns into another direction and make them zigzag. And the running stitch is, well, it's just about the easiest stitch there is. So the technique is quite simple. You go up and down with your needle. And the whole pattern you get by placing your stitches. How do you place them? More to the left. And how far you let them zigzag and how long you will make your zigzag, that's up to you. You can just experiment with that. And for instance, you can have zigzags that are going like this, or you can have zigzags that are going like this, or maybe like this. So that's all kinds of different types of zigzags that you can do, and it depends on how long you will go on in a certain direction, and also how quickly you will shift. And for instance, if you don't shift one thread of the fabric to the right or left, but two threads, you can imagine that you will have a more wilder zigzag. So we'll continue with this for a bit. Are there any questions about this zigzag pattern? This is luckily quite easy, but also a good way to get a feel for how you can steer your columns in a certain direction. And we'll switch to another pattern soon. And as I said, you can't do all the, we can't complete all the patterns, because as you can already perhaps experience, this is a quite time-consuming stitch. But this first pattern is a very good way to get a feel for how it works and how you can get your columns to move. And I think I can get one last row out of this thread. So how is that going so far? And anyone experiencing problems or having a question? So then I will replace my hoop for the next pattern, and that's already getting a little bit more complicated. Wow, I really tightened this up. And yeah, and I'm also choosing new threads. And again, I would like to ask everyone to mute your microphone while we're working, and only unmute it when you want to ask a question. And let's choose these colors now. So for the next pattern, we're going to not let the columns move all move in the same direction. So not zigzagging anymore. But we're going to make shapes with a pointy character, like in this bit. So the columns can move in their own direction. Sometimes they will bump into each other and sometimes they will divide. And we'll see how that works as we go along. But I want the shapes to be rather pointed. And that's different from this pattern, for instance. The shapes are more rounded. And I'll first set my needle. And I'll show you in a drawing.
Marianne,
Yeah.
sorry, Karen. There's somebody isn't muted, and there's a lot of their noise is actually
Yeah.
overlaying on yours, and I'm not catching anything you're saying. Is there water going on?
Yeah, so please, people, when you're not
Sorry about
asking
that.
questions, please mute your microphone so that we can't hear the background because in Zoom they can be quite disturbing.
It's a wee bit, yes. Sorry, guys, thank
No,
you.
no, you're quite right. And so what I want to explain is, suppose you want to have a round form as opposed to a pointed shape. If I'm going to fill in these shapes with line, for the pointed shape, I need to start with a very, very short line. And on the fabric, that might be just one thread.
One thread.
And then a second one.
Yeah.
Slowly, they're growing wider in a more or less constant factor.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a round shape, that works completely different. I already have to start with a wider stitch to fill the bottom of that rounded shape. And then the next line, the next stitch will be significantly wider. And then that one will be wider too. And then only when I go upwards, then the difference between the width of the stitches will become minimal. So the widening a lot at first, and then only a little bit later on. And that's the difference for getting pointed shapes or round shapes. And that can also happen when you want to come together as you divide. So let's say I have columns leaning towards each other. Now, if I would want a pointed shape, I will go on like this, let them slowly lean towards each other until they can merge into one column. But if I would want rounded shapes, then, for instance, I would want a more rounded shape here. I would quickly come to a point, much quicker, where they would have to merge into one column.
Put your work clothes in there as well, and I'll.
They're out there.
Yeah, just throw them in there, and I'll do a load. I'll put the mop end in when I've finished. Yeah, I'm muted.
So let's start with the more pointed shapes. And we're starting like more or less the same as with the zigzag. So let's make a series of running stitches. Of more or less the same length. And I think that pause for a moment and that I'm going to close the curtain behind me. Because the sun is coming up over the house behind us and giving spots on my fabric. Yep. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it doesn't matter. Could be 6 too. And again, I'm turning the hoop and going back for the second row. And again, not being too precise about it, doing more or less the same. But don't worry if it's a bit more to the left, to the right. So not be too precise about it. So now I have 2 rows, and for the zigzag pattern, it was quite simple. They will, at a certain point, they were all going to lean to the right or all going to lean to the left. But here I'm letting it happen more by chance. So I can look at what I have now, and I can see, for instance, it's rather difficult to see perhaps, that here the second row is a little bit more to the left. So I'll say, oh, I'll go with that. While here, for this fourth column, it looks like the second stitch is a little bit more to the right. So I have got, so to speak, little prompts on which way each column would like to go. And for this moment, I'm going to follow that. So this one is going to be the thread of the knot behind it. Here, going a little bit more to the left. This one stays in place more or less. This one, the second stitch seems to be a bit smaller. Okay, I'll go with that and make it yet a little bit smaller. This one seems to be leaning to the right. And I'll follow that. And this one seems to be still pretty straightforward going up. So I'm kind of now following, or you could say exaggerating, what was already happening. And now I'm going back. And still following that little bit of pattern that was starting to appear. And now I can see certain things happening. This one is clearly leaning to the left now, but this one is getting smaller. This one is leaning to the right. So it seems a bit like these columns are going to lean towards each other, while this one is by now getting quite small. And so what am I going to do about it? And this is a point where you can choose and you can decide. You can say, okay, I will follow that, and it will mean that this column will end at a certain point, while these columns will grow towards each other. But you can also say, no, I do not want that. I don't want one color to disappear this quickly. So I'll purposefully steer them in a slightly different direction and, for instance, widen this column. So you can partly follow what's happening on the fabric, but also have a certain grip on the pattern and make it move in the direction that you want, that you choose. And there's a little bit of a balance in that. Nevertheless, I see now that there's quite a big gap appearing between these two columns on the left. And I think I'm going to do something about that by creating a new column. And I'll show you how I do that. And because this pattern is going to be about pointed shapes, I want to do that by starting with a very small stitch. So I'll come up, go down here, and then come up in the, oh, if my thread wants to stay in the needle. Yeah. Go down here, and then come up in the middle of the gap. And just make a stitch just over one thread of the fabric. So that new stitch is just, you can hardly see it, a tiny dot in the middle of that gap. And then I'll continue the row. And at this point, I do want to widen up this one a bit. And now in the next row, for most of the columns, I'm just following the direction that they're going at this point. Still making this column here in the middle a little bit wider yet. And I have plenty of space here on the right side to do that. And now I come to that little dot, that little new that column that I started. And I make that stitch, the new stitch, a little bit wider. Just a little bit on each side. So this is now maybe 3 threads of the fabric. And then the dot in the middle there starts to be a bit more clear. And let's see if I can get to the other end. Yeah, I think I have a new. You can end your thread and start your thread whenever you want. But I tend to like to just start and end at the beginning of a row. There's no special reason. As I said, when your thread ends in the middle of a row, you just go down, tuck it under at the back, and that's okay. But as you can already see a little bit, on the back side, you have a negative pattern. And I'll show you with this one, for instance, if I turn that around, you see the negative pattern. And as you can see here, I've used knots and the tucking under of the tails of the thread wasn't all that neat. You can imagine if you are able to hide these ends of the thread rather nicely, you will have a pattern on both sides. And that, I think that would look great, for instance, on as a border on, let's say, a blouse or something. Or, but that would be a lot of work on a scarf or something like that, that you can see a pattern on both sides. But then you would need to hide your threads really, really well. So I haven't done anything like that yet. My backsides are usually a little bit messy. But it is what you're doing with this stitch, you're actually weaving through the fabric. And with a weave, you have warp threads and weft threads. And actually, you're adding new weft threads. And in the Indian style embroidery of Kanta, this stitch is also called a darning stitch. And you can imagine that if you constantly weave this stitch through the fabric, that will will be able to reinforce thin fabrics like this. And that way this stitch can be used for darning, for repairing and reinforcing fabrics that are a bit worn. So I'm going to make this new column that I have here a little bit wider yet. And because I am aiming for pointed shapes, it's just a little bit wider, not too much. And it can happen that you, because it can happen that your stitches are somehow on top of each other. That's okay. But it can also happen that you inadvertently do the new row a little bit too far from the previous row and that you have a kind of gap. And if that's too conspicuous, you can easily put in with the same color thread some extra stitches to fill in the gap. So if at a certain point you say, oh, I have got a bit of a gap there, I don't like that, that is quite easy to fill in, and that will not be noticeable. What was my next color? This dark orange. So I take one strand of the darkest color and then one strand of the lighter color. And there is quite a difference in color between these two, but taking one strand of one and one strand of the second color, the transition will be very smooth. One.
Hi, Miriam.
Yeah.
Oh, so I wasn't sure if you could hear me. I
Yeah.
just wanted to ask, I'm finding it very difficult to keep a sort of straight line across the top as I go up. My lines are becoming uneven. How do you, I mean, would it help if I had I've got a fine grain cotton here, I guess a bigger.
Bit of difficulty to see the grain and follow the grain.
Yes.
In that case, maybe you could start with a line by drawing a line with a pencil or a fabric marker, or draw the outline of the shape that you want to make.
Okay.
it is usually not necessary to draw the pattern, but you can of course use a pencil or a fabric marker to give a bit of a guideline. And in the case, I would then choose for a fabric marker that you can, that's either heat erasable or it disappears by itself.
Okay, thank you.
And I understand that for some fabric with very fine grain, it can be more difficult to follow the grain. And I think I want more things happening here. So I'm going to let these two columns come together. So I'm making the gap between them a bit smaller. And how much you want to happen, that is your own choice. And I'll show you on this one. You can see that also see a bit of the negative space between the columns, that sometimes they were going on for quite a while, for multiple rows, without ever bumping into each other, or things were, there were quite a few very calm stretches with nothing much happening. Whereas this pattern, this side, also has pointed shapes, but immediately from the start there were columns bumping into each other and then quickly dividing again. So it's also a choice of when and how do you want things to happen, and you can let the columns calmly move on in more or less the same direction for a while, or you can very often give them little nudges and steer them in a certain direction, and that way make things happen. And as you can see here, now is quite a serious column starting to appear. So sometimes I just follow what's going on, what's already there. And sometimes I take a decision because I want something else to happen. And I want to steer the process in a certain direction. And this gap is slowly getting smaller. Now, if I would like to work with more rounded shapes, I would probably now cross over this gap. But I want pointed shapes, so I'll just make the gap a little bit smaller yet. And I think I'm now something like 4 threads of the fabric for this gap. And now because this new column here, and it's widening, the column on the left of that is getting smaller. And now I have to decide, do I want to move that to the left, or do I want to keep a straight outline? And if I do that, I'm getting in trouble, so to speak, or maybe I should say this column is getting into trouble because it's getting to be very, very small. So maybe here it's a good idea to let these two later on merge into one column. So I'm not going to let this column disappear. I'll make it a little bit wider. And that one is still getting wider too. So slowly the gap between these two will disappear. And now here on this side, the gap between the two columns is already very small. And now I'll make it even smaller by picking up just, in this case, one thread of the fabric. I can imagine that you can hardly see it. Just one thread now. And then, of course, in the next bit, next row, I will close the gap completely. And here, so I'm sometimes thinking, this gap is getting quite big, or I want something to happen here, and then I will steer the column in another direction and then see where it wants to go. So now this new column that I've created here is actually getting quite wide. So what I can do in the next bit is to, in the next row, is to divide that. To divide the column into two columns. And that I do that by picking up just one thread in the middle of that column. And that is the division, the new gap between two columns. I hope I'm making myself clear. By just picking up one thread of the fabric there in the middle, I'm creating a new gap. And therefore dividing that column into two, while here the two columns have merged and became one. And it also means that the gap between these two is getting quite big. So maybe I also start a new column here. And again, by coming up in the middle of the gap. And then immediately going down again. So I have a stitch that's just one thread of the fabric wide. And then here, where I have created a new gap, divided that column, I will have to widen that gap. So instead of just one thread of the fabric, I will now pick up 3 threads of the fabric. while here the gap is nearly closed. I'll pick up there just one thread of the fabric, and then on the way back I will close that gap. Wow. So there you're constantly choosing to widen stitches, make them smaller, and at a certain point they're so wide you will want to divide them. Or the gap is getting so wide you will want to start a new column. So any questions at this point? And are things happening on your fabric, and how is it going? Looks quite right, Carolyn. Yeah. So how much thread have I left? I can do, oh, sorry, bumped into my camera. Ooh, I will not have much thread left at the end of this row. That is cutting it close. So now I'm taking 2 threads of the middle color. Yeah, that was this one. So with creating a pattern with these pointed shapes, things are happening at a relatively slow pace, because you're widening or lessening a gap just maybe 1 or 2 threads of the fabric at a time. So this type of pattern has a slow pace, and you have time to decide what's happening and what you want to see on the fabric. And you can create all kind of types of pattern like this. And I wanted to show you that if you find it difficult, and you could also make drawings of this type of pattern. And I've done that on this paper with, I drew lines with pencil, and then filled them in with watercolor pencils, Inktense pencils. And like here you see a pattern with lines that some 2 by 2, they are sometimes coming together and dividing, but in between that, not so much. While here, this pattern, for instance, they constantly coming together, dividing, etc. This is a zigzag pattern, quite wild, while this one, for instance, this green one, is much more calm. And for this pattern with the dots, there are only very small columns that are starting, but shortly after that, ending again. While here you have a kind of the same thing, but these are a little bit longer, and I let these zigzag, and also these are quite pointed. So this drawing patterns like this is one of the ways that you can get a feel for what you can do and how you can make these patterns. And my goal for this was to create a series of squares that were each very different. And not all of them would be so easy to translate to stitch. I think, for instance, this one in the middle, then you would get a very, very, very wide stitch here. And you can have a lot of variation in the width of a stitch, but it does have its limitations. If you would have such an extremely wide stitch, then at a certain point the thread would start to sag. Oh, there's someone in the waiting room. Hi, Valeria. Welcome. And I hope you can follow along, or else when the recordings will be posted on Patreon, you can watch the beginning of the class again. So we're creating a pattern where columns bump into each other, divide, creating new columns, coming together, merging into one column. And also, I think it was you, Carolyn, who asked about if you have trouble having a very straight line, you could
Yes,
also,
that's me.
if your line is bending too much, do a partial line to fill in a certain indentation in your line. So there are several ways that you can correct for things that when they don't work, filling in some extra stitches or skipping stitches. If I would, for instance, have a little bump here in the middle, I would perhaps skip the middle stitches, 1 or 2 rows. What you should not do is change to the satin stitch. If, for instance, I would say I want this column here on the right, just this one column is lagging behind, and I want that to grow a bit taller to catch up with the other columns. I could choose to work just on that one color, and then I would be doing a satin stitch. But the running stitch that we're doing lies really flat on the fabric. It weaves itself like a wave through the fabric, while the satin stitch has more volume, and you would see that. So you can make a similar pattern with satin stitch, but it will look differently. It will not be the same. So I would advise against mixing the two.
Miriam, can I ask you, have you ever just undone it, any work, because it's not doing anything for you?
Yeah. Oh, yes, yes. I mean, with these sample cloth, it's okay if it's not working, because, you know, it's a sample cloth. So then you are allowed to make mistakes or to try something and then say, oh no, God, no, I don't like this. So in those cases, I find it perfectly okay to just leave that and try something else. But when I'm doing, let's say, for real work, I wouldn't mind at all undoing stitches or starting over again. Or, I mean, you do need to feel happy with what you're doing. And I know I also know that there are teachers that say you have to learn to live with your mistakes and embrace your mistakes. But I think, well, you know, it's your party. And if you're not happy with what you see on the fabric, uh, undo it and try something else. You don't need to be overcritical about what you're doing, and often you can make things work. Add a bit of a contrasting color or try another stitch or whatever. But if you're not happy with what you're making, yeah, I've started things and not finished them. I've undone stitches and tried something else. I've did an applique over a bit that I didn't like. Yeah, I certainly adjust when I'm feeling that something is not working the way I want. But with this sample cloth that now we are making, I would say allow yourself to see what happened, and if it's something that you say, oh no, this doesn't look good, just let it be and try again, because we're going quite quickly through from one pattern to the other now. But normally I would say, for instance, stay with the zigzags for a while and feel how that works for you and how you can make them zigzag, so that you give yourself time to get adjusted to this type of pattern, what you can do with it, and how you can steer it in the direction that you want. And a bit like learning to drive. At first, it will not be all that simple, and you probably bump into something at a certain point. You just need time to feel how this works. So is anybody having problems with something or want to ask something? Good. Well, I'm thinking that we can switch to the next pattern, if you're okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
And you can later finish this one and see what you can do with it. And now we're going to try a pattern with rounded shape. So I'll readjust my hoop. And choose some other colors. I'm constantly starting with the darkest color because I hope then it will show up in the video more, give you some contrast. But of course, you can choose any type of color that you like. I've also done, I'm still working on it, still not finished.
Oh my gosh.
And this is an example of that you can do the patterns in all kinds of directions. And I've just divided a bigger blob on the fabric into different sections. And like with the drawings that I made, I used some of them also as inspiration. I try to make very different type of patterns in more pastel colors. And they do have a lovely shine, but I must say the pastel colors are not very, they're not jumping off the fabric, so to speak. They're very subtle. But this is, and I still have to, it takes a long time. And I was slightly disappointed in the pastel colors not standing out all that much. But I do think that it will be worth my while to finish it sometime. But the colors can make a lot of difference in the type of pattern that you make and the type of feel that you get. So much bolder colors will maybe perhaps lead to much bolder patterns. So new thread. And as I said, with the rounded shapes, you have that you all start or end with a much wider stitch. And for instance, if I would have a column that I would like to divide at a certain point because it's getting very wide, and I would, if I would do a pointed shape, like I said, I would just make a gap just one thread of the fabric wide, so a very small gap, and then slowly widening that gap in each consecutive row. But if I want a more rounded shape, I have to make things happen more quickly. So again, having a column getting quite wide. And then I would at first leave a gap that is a lot wider. And then in the row after that, still wider, quite a bit wider. And then perhaps slowly make them move upward again. Like I said, if you do a circle, so you can see that this is more a shape like this, and this is more a rounded shape. And if you would draw a circle, I just put my hoop aside for a minute. Not a perfect circle, but that doesn't matter. So then, like I said at the beginning, you get a rather wide stitch, and stitch is growing wider quite quickly. But when you get to the middle of the circle, the stitches are not all that different in width. So if you compare, so this first stitch and then the second stitch is maybe twice as wide. And the third stitch is also quite a bit wider. But here in the middle, there's not much difference between the width of the stitches there. So in the beginning, lots of things are happening quite quickly, and you need to move things like with 2 or 3 threads of the fabric at least. But then in the middle of a round shape, nothing much is happening, while at the end, again, the width of the stitches lessens quite significantly, and you end also with a stitch of a certain width. So that's what we're going to try to do in the next pattern. And then it will look a bit more like this pattern with more rounded shapes. And also I've done, and I'm going to try to do that too, make columns that are quite short and more like a dot, a little dot or a little circle or a little oval. And I want to take my cue from this bit of the pattern where you see that are right in the beginning, there are also columns that end quite quickly. But I'll do, I think, like 6 stitches now. And 6. And again, that's the same as with the previous pattern. When I go back for the second row, I kind of let things happen. Maybe one stitch will be a bit wider or a bit smaller. And that's okay. Not being too precise about it. The thread keeps escaping from the eye of the needle, although the eye isn't all that big. Probably just me. And again, now I'm looking at, do I already see things happening in the difference between the first and the second row? Yeah, there's some, this one seems to, stitch seems to be a bit more to the right, but they're pretty much looking quite equal. And now I'm deliberately making the stitch in the second column a tiny bit smaller. So you can also choose in what measure you want to just stitch intuitively and then see what happens and then react to that. Or perhaps if you from the beginning want to steer the whole process in a specific direction. And usually it's a bit of a balance between that. I don't know if some of you have experienced that the columns can have a mind of their own. And that you can have so, oh, where did that gap go all of a sudden? And what I'm going to do with that? So it's a bit of a balance between seeing what happens and then feeling if you want to go with that movement or that you want something else, or being very specific about what you want and what you want the columns to do and which way you want them to lean, etc. Now, going back, I see that there are a few things happening. Slowly this gap is widening, but that's okay. Certainly not getting too wide yet. But here, at this point, the gap is already getting smaller. And now if I would want a pointed shape, I would let this go on for a while. And it would take me several rows more to slowly, bit by bit, close this gap. But now I want to have a rounded shape. So I'm deliberately making this gap quite a bit smaller. And I'm now picking up like 3 threads of the fabric. Also, at the same time, making this column quite a bit wider. And then in the next row, because I'm aiming for rounded shapes, I will need to close this gap now and not let it grow smaller. And that will make this stitch, I could do that, I'll show you, a very wide stitch. I think I can pull that off. It is a very big stitch, only if I now would proceed upwards and leave the stitch this wide, I think I would get a very bulky column, and that would look strange in between the others. So I'm going to do something about that on the way back, if my thread allows that. And I will divide this side of the column into 2. And again, because I want rounded shapes, I'm not picking up just 1 thread of the fabric, but more. And I think this is 4 threads. But it also could have been 3 or 5, depending on your fabric, of course. And a bit because now you have to close gaps a bit earlier and start new gaps that are quite wide, or start a new column that's already quite wide. Things can, with a rounded shape, things can happen faster. And you also have to be a little bit more aware of them. Oh, and I'm seeing now that at least here in the Netherlands, it's 10:30. We've been at it for 1.5 hours now. I suggest that we take a little break, like a 15-minute break, so you can stretch your legs a bit and walk around and get yourself some fresh tea or coffee or something. I will pause the recording and I'll be back in 15 minutes. See you in a while. And I need a new thread. And taking one from the darker color and one from the slightly lighter color. What I haven't tried yet with this stitch, and that could be fun, is to mix two completely different threads, colors of thread in the needle. Like for instance, a yellow thread and a blue thread or something. And see what happens then and what kind of effect that gives. But I haven't tried that yet. And this type of color grading the color like this by taking one strand of a darker color and one of a somewhat lighter color. That also works very well with the satin stitch. I use it there also. And I personally, I like it a lot. And it has a lovely effect with this stitch. So, making more rounded shapes, and that's here with these two columns coming together, and there one is dividing. But I also want to try to end a column. Where these two are also leaning together. Maybe I'll try and end this column. I just want to show you how that works. And also trying to see if I can at a certain point make a very short column that's basically just a dot. So now again here I have a gap that is still 4 or 5 threads wide, but I think I'm also going to cross over that one and then significantly widening this gap here. So with these more rounded shapes, you need to be more careful, and if you want them to be round, you have to make things happen quite a lot. And if I now want to round off this column, I'll have to make the next stitch quite a bit smaller. Like what happens when you, with the circle, when you come to the top of the circle.
Chat gebeuren, kun je dat zien?
Ja.
En waar is dat? Ik heb iets veranderd. Ook steeds kanon. Je denkt van.
So now for this one, making a last stitch for this column that is just about 3 threads of the fabric wide. And what am I going to do here? This can still widen, but this is also already getting quite wide. Now leave that for a bit, making only this gap wider. Starting a new gap here, perhaps. And now I'm skipping this column. Leaving me with quite a bit of a gap here. So I'll start closing that up in the next row. Well, at least closing it up, making it smaller. And now on purpose, I've widened this gap a lot. So I'm starting a new column there, and I'm starting it by coming up in the middle and making a stitch that already has some width. So compared with starting a new column in a pattern with very pointy shapes, where you only had a very tiny speck of thread for the start of the new column, I'm making a stitch here over 3 or 4 threads of the fabric. So starting new columns, ending columns, closing gaps, opening up gaps with rounded shapes, that happens quite a bit faster. And it also means that you have more instances when you have to take a decision. How do I want to proceed? What do I want to do? So now I'm going again to this new column that I've started. And I want to make that like with the stripes here in the circle. I want to make that new stitch, the second stitch for that column, quite a bit wider. And starting a new column also means that the columns on the side of that need to make space for it. So these inevitably move to this outwards. And let's say this was a very conscious decision to make this gap quite wide and start a new column here. But then then happens, and I did not make a conscious decision about that, that just happened, is that this gap is leaning towards the right. And that's okay, I'll go with that. And we'll see what happens there. And here, this gap is closing, but still not completely. I have a bit of a gap there yet. And now going back, I need to close that gap. But then again, a very wide stitch is going to happen there. So what do I want to do about that? And I think I want to divide that very wide stitch. So closing the gap here, but also again here. Making a new gap so that the columns don't get to be too wide and too bulky. And now here I can diminish the speed in which the stitches widen. So the next stitch will be only slightly wider than the previous one. And somehow I also get the feeling that with this pattern with the rounded shapes, my threads end sooner, like it's more filled in, and I think it is compared to the other one. So I have to change threads more. So this is the back side. This is the front. Yeah, it is indeed a little bit more of a dense pattern. So now 2 threads of the lighter, somewhat lighter green. Sorry. So how is everyone faring with the rounded shapes? Do you find them easier or more difficult than the pointed shapes?
More difficult.
I'm finding it, yeah, more difficult. I'm
Yeah.
finding it more difficult.
Yeah.
Same here.
They are more difficult. And as I said, we're doing a little bit of each pattern. And normally you would, if outside of this class, you would probably stay with a certain pattern for a longer time. And that does help because I can also give you an example of that. Here these 2 patterns actually, this one and this one, I wanted to do them in a certain shape, a bit of a rounded shape, and this one is a bit of a blob. And I also wanted to do them with a very specific pattern here with columns that came together, divided, etc. But in between, very short columns, like dots in between. And for this pattern, I decided I wanted the columns to constantly divide and come together. So that it was a pattern, there was a lot happening at the same time, leaving only these little gaps open. And at the other side, you can see that it's the threads that form the dots. So both were very specific patterns that I needed to have a lot of control over, deciding now this has to happen and now that has to happen. And at the same time, I was trying to fill in a shape, and as you can see with this one, that didn't exactly work out immediately. I started on this side, and at first I really had difficulty starting this pattern and finding my my rhythm in this pattern. And as I moved up, it became easier, and I got a kind of feeling for what I needed to do, and how the columns needed to grow and to come together and to divide. So it's a good thing to experiment with this type of pattern, with this stitch, and see what you can do, and that will take some time to get used to it. And also when you make larger samples, like this blue one, for instance, here I clearly experienced that I got into a certain kind of rhythm and could also more or less repeat things that I had done before. And I was really getting the hang of it. And that does take time. So indeed, these rounded shapes are more difficult. And when you stay with them for a while and practice them, you will find that it slowly will become easier. So continuing. And let's continue the bye, Laurie. Thank you for being here. Laurie has to leave. Let's stick with the rounded shapes for a bit. And then I also would like to try to make a pattern in a certain outline. So in a blob or in a circle, for instance. And it's also good to pause every now and then and think, okay, where is this going and what's happening? And are there things that I want to change? And perhaps you can see that a lot of things are happening on the left and not so much on the right. And that are the moments that you can give a little nudge in a certain direction and steer the process in the way that you want it to develop. So now for the dot here, I am, I think, slightly over the middle, but not doing a stitch that is a little bit smaller. Yeah. That can go quite quickly. Or now in the next row, I might already come to the point that I will do the last stitch of this dot. Let's see if I do that. One last stitch, if that looks good. Yeah, that does look like a bit of a circle, and it means that this is Let's see if I can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think it's just 6 rows. So a rather small dot. And then also that means that for when I go back, I will have to skip this whole bit and have there have quite a big gap. Let's see what I can do with that. And I could do a similar thing, but with a negative space here. Here I have a little round gap appearing, and I could also close that up quite quickly. And I think I have now done my stitch a bit, going up a bit too much. I try to stay in a straight line. I'm not exactly checking if I'm still perfectly on the grain, but I don't want to go off too much. And if you feel that, for instance, at the left side of your sample, the columns are growing more quickly than on the right, like I said, you can perhaps do a partial row on the side that is lagging behind to correct that. Because, and that's with this stitch, I practically always use the stranded cotton embroidery floss, because the threads are soft and ply easily. They lie quite flat on the fabric, and because of their softness and because they're not all that twisted compared to pearl thread, for instance, they merge into one surface. If you would do this stitch with pearl thread, then you would see the separate stitches more, and that would have a different, and I think perhaps an effect that the threads don't merge that much into one surface. And I think that will not look as good, but of course you can always try, and perhaps you're very satisfied with the effect. And now what would I do here? Yeah, let's move that a little bit more in that direction. Now I think I'm ready to close this here, yeah. And here I'm starting to get a very big gap. So I'm doing something in the middle there, starting a new column. Don't know if that will become just a dot or a longer column. We'll see. And then here. I also feel that the rhythm of making these rounded shapes is different, and there's a lot more happening here, and you have to take a lot more decisions on what you want to do and where you want to go. And again, a new thread. And the fact that there's more happening also means that there is more possible. And that is what you can see in this sample. For instance, here, I managed to let these, it looks like these two arms are spiraling around each other. And that I had divided this column, but let one arm end. And then in the gap that was here, I let a new column start and let that merge with the column there. So there is more happening, but you also have a little bit more possibilities to play with it. And yeah, there's several types of things that you can do. And I think I have not yet done experimenting and finding all the possibilities for this stitch. And yet another thread. Yep, skipping that one. So feel free to ask a question if you are bumping into something. I also feel that with this pattern with the rounded shapes, you have more difference in the width of the columns than you have with the pattern with the pointed shapes, where there are more or less, there's a kind of average width, and that they usually tend to stick to. But here you can sometimes have very small stitches, very big ones. And that is a little bit more difficult to control. And what you also can do, if you want, is then if you're doing such a pattern as this, sometimes just putting it away for a bit, that can help. And then when you pick it up, you will perhaps start, you look at it in a different light and see other things. And what also can help is to have some distance to it. And it could help for such a pattern, but I do it with other works sometimes too. It was a tip I got from someone to place my work on the ground and walk around it, so that you can literally look at it from all sides. And that might also give an idea of what you can do. And I see now, for instance, that at this point, I have 5 columns, whereas I started with 6. So somewhere along I have lost a column, but because I'm constantly ending columns or starting new ones, that number of columns that I have will keep changing, and that's okay. I think it might perhaps look weird if I went from 6 columns to 3 columns, for instance. Then I would get very wide and bulky stitches. But when you start out with 6, I think it's okay if you go back to 5 or 4, or perhaps up to 7 or 8. Now here I didn't do a new dot, a new circle, but I let this new column, lean to the left a bit. And that diminished the gap with the column next to it. So now I'm merging the two. And when I go back, you can see that by doing that, I have kind of created a sort of arm here that is now connected to the column on the left. So by making a conscious decision about what type of shapes I want to have, I also set some parameters for the process. And that makes a difference for what you are getting, but you can, of course, mix pointed and rounded shapes. Why not? It's just that with these two, I wanted to give you a feel for how different they can be. And I'm also looking at the clock, so I'll stop now with this pattern with the round shapes, loosen my hoop and find a new spot. But first, I would like to show you how that you can also work in a different type of shape. Now we have been making kind of rectangular shapes, going a straight line, going with the grain of the fabric, and then going upwards with more or less straight outlines. But you can also roll something of the fabric. I'm just using a pencil here. I hope that will work on this linen. And have more of a circle or blob shape. The pencil is quite light, so I don't know if you can see it. So I put it in the hoop. And now also, besides the fact that this isn't a square or rectangular shape, I also want to show you that you do not always need to go with the grain of the fabric. So what color shall I choose? Maybe this blue color. And I will start doing something, and I don't know what yet. Maybe this is going to be a pattern that is more, things are left more up to chance. And just see what happens if pointed or round shapes appear. And it also means that now if I say I want to start, let's say on this side and go that way, and I'm diagonally on the grain, well, that doesn't matter much. I just come up wherever I want. But it also means that I can start perhaps with only 2 columns here at the bottom. And hardly even that, I think. This is a very short column. So that can happen if you fill in a certain shape, that you have to start with just 2 stitches, or maybe even 1. And then for where the stitches come up and where they end, where the row starts and where it ends, I take my cue from the outline of the circle that I've drawn. that's going to define the outline. And then I can already see, and yeah, this is what happens when you fill in a circle, that the stitches grow bigger very, very quickly. So now I already have quite a large stitch on this side. So you know what? Let's divide that one. And I happened to pick up 3 threads of the fabric, so that's okay. I'm going with that. This is going to be a little bit more intuitive. So at this moment, quite short rows. And lots of turning of the hoop. And when you work like this on the bias, diagonally on the grain, it might be more difficult to keep a straight line. So again, that's perhaps something to stop every now and then and see if I put my needle next to it and I see that I have to be careful to let that left side grow in the same pace. So instead of perhaps going 1 thread further, I'll go 2 threads further and hope that that doesn't make a gap. So perhaps sometimes put your needle on it or the thread on it and see if you're still going in a straight line. And I do want things also here to happen. And also my rows are starting to get wider. And I think that on the way back, I will divide this stitch in 2 also. There's an extra element here of having to keep your eye on the outline. And now I've stitched through the bit of my fabric. So filling up a certain shape, like a circle or a blob or triangle or whatever, that brings in an extra element. And here certainly the number of columns will constantly grow until I get to the middle of the circle where it will stay the same for a bit. After which the number of columns will gradually diminish. It is also the type of stitch that I sometimes pick it up and think, yeah, let's do this for like 10 minutes, quarter of an hour, do a little bit of stitching. But you're constantly wondering what will happen in the next row. And it's, in a way, it's quite addictive and not all that easy to put away. And it's kind of fascinating to see a pattern grow, even without having a pre-drawn pattern. You simply do not, you can set your parameters, as I said, the type of stitches that you want, the shapes that you want to have, round or pointed, going upward a lot or zigzagging a lot. That are the choices that you can make, but how the pattern will eventually look, what specific pattern you will end up with, that's always a bit of a surprise.
Miriam, can I just say I like this much better than the other one? And I happen to have just done straight a circle. So
And you find this easier or
yeah,
more
I do.
intuitive?
Yes, yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
So I got a circle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Without trying.
Yeah, it can be that you're just, you know, you feel more, a little bit more freedom in a shape like this. Yeah. And it's also, and it depends on what you like to do, and everyone is different, I think, in that aspect. Do you want to have a lot of control and create a very specific type of pattern, or are you just fine with letting the columns decide and just go with the flow and only intervene when stitches are getting too wide or where gaps are getting too wide. And for the rest, just go with the flow and see what happens. So there are different types of approaches with this stitch. Again, I get to the other end. Yeah, just about. And I must say, I would like to do this on some piece of clothing sometime. But then I will need to think about how much work I want to put into it. But perhaps, on the pockets of a blouse or something, on the cuffs. I think that would look great. So maybe now I'll do the thing what I said, combine two completely different colors just to see what happens. So if I take this, I still have one thread of the dark blue, yeah, and combine it with a more brown thread. I'm just going to try and see what happens. Maybe I like it, maybe I don't. But sometimes you need to try and do a little experiment. I think I need to take care that the line is straight here on the left side. Yeah. What I also can do then is I've got a feeling that in the middle, the column is growing faster than on the sides. So what I do now, is to, in the middle, to stitch exactly over the previous stitch. So not moving that column up. Yeah, I think that worked. Now it looks straighter. think it's very difficult to see yet the mixing of the two colors, but it does have a nice effect. The new color kind of shimmering through. But I think on the camera it's quite hard to see, because there are both relatively dark colors. I can imagine if I would have mixed this dark blue with, for instance, a very light yellow, that would show up more. And now at this point, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. And there probably be a bit more. I'll continue with this circle and with mixing very different colors of threads and see what that does. So far, I'm quite liking it. And then maybe later I'll take a good picture and post it on Patreon. So coming to the end of my thread. And also looking at the clock, we've got a quarter of an hour left. And so this is a good moment to first ask you if there's something you want to ask. And also I would love to, if you, someone would love like to show what you've made so far. Yes, Karen, I'll spotlight you.
Sorry, I don't know how I sort of lose it when I try and show it. Can you see?
Oh yeah,
So
Yeah.
I'm sort of doing my circles becoming quite regimented. That's the sorry, that's the
point.
tighter one with, and that was the circles. So
Yeah.
my circles weren't as good as the other one. I find that easier doing the zigzag shapes and doing circles.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then I'm doing a circle here, which is coming out quite regular. I don't
You hold
this
a little bit more to the right. That is, it's
to the right. Is that my right?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
There you go.
Yeah,
There you
that's-
go, guys. Yeah, so my
Yeah, it's-
circle I've drawn is becoming quite, it
Yeah.
didn't set out that way. It's just become quite a regular shape appearing.
Yeah, yeah. Who knows where it will lead?
I know, but I've really, really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Somebody else who wants to show?
I'm happy to show.
Yeah.
So that's my circle. Where am I there? Can you see?
Yeah, yeah.
And then the others.
Oh, I like the one with the rounded shapes. Yeah.
You
Looking
do?
good. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think I need more work though.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very typical for this.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Miriam, I want to say thank you as well. It's been fantastic.
You're welcome. It's been
Yeah.
lovely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Someone else who wants to show her work?
I'll show. I'm not particularly good, but it's as good as I can get it at the moment.
Yeah.
Can you see?
Just a moment. I have to spotlight you. Yeah.
Yeah, the rounded ones, that's the bottom
Oh, yeah.
one.
Yeah.
My
That's
shape
successful.
and
Yeah.
pointy at the top.
Yeah.
And the first ones were terrible, but it was a way to start. I've improved, you can see.
Just like a kind of warming up.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I've loved the class. It's great. It's fun.
Thank you.
Relaxing.
So anyone wants to mention something, ask something, show something?
Miriam, when you do a circle one, do you draw a small circle in the middle and start from there?
Yeah, I do. And that was this one. And I even do that. I did it with, I think I used a coin and drew a circle around it and started with that. And it's very difficult to start right from the center, but even with this ball, I made first a little circle with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 very small stitches. And then I started with even a wider circle, worked outward first, and then later filled in by going inward. But in the middle, it's very difficult to have only, let's say, 3 or 4 very small stitches and create a circle with that. So I just filled it in with some stitches crossing each other just to fill in the center of such a circle. Dus I either leave the circle open, so indeed to draw a circle around a coin, for instance, and then go outward, or later move inward with what I have until it just doesn't work anymore and the stitches are going to overlap, and then improvise, basically. Yeah. So I think we can wrap up. And I thank you all for being here from all over the world in very different time zones. And it's been lovely to stitch together. And I hope you will enjoy proceeding with this stitch and trying more patterns and expanding your samples. And I will be posting the recording of this session. I will upload it as a hidden video on YouTube, and the link to that video I will share on Patreon with paid members. So it will only be accessible to other paid members and not outside of Patreon. So thank you very much. And
Oh, thank you
see
very
you
much.
next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Fantastic again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.